Stephen, and good evening, brethren and sisters and young people. We left Judah, of course, being the leader in the betrayal of Joseph, and we saw the motive for that, the prophet motive that was there in Genesis chapter 37 and verse 26. But because time was failing me, I failed to mention one important thing about what Joseph's brethren did to him. It says in the record that they stripped him of his coat. Remember that? They stripped him of his coat. They could have left him in his coat, couldn't they? But they stripped him of the coat, brothers and sisters and young people, because they hated the spirituality of Joseph. They disliked him immensely because he was the spiritual boy in the family. He was not popular for that reason. So they stripped his coat from him. And of course they took that coat, blood spattered, to tell Jacob that he'd lost his son, bringing about in Jacob's life one of the most horrendous periods of grief that the Bible ever records. Inconsolable grief that he went through for a very, very long time. 22 years, in fact, the length of the 38th chapter of Genesis. I think I might have said 15 earlier today. Incorrect. It was 22 years of grief that came upon Jacob. And that's the period that covers Genesis 38, 22 years. And in that there's packed a lot of things. And I suppose you're a bit like me. Sometimes when I read this record, I think to myself, well, why is that there? Look at all the grubby things. Look at the things that Judah gets up to. Look at the things that we read in this chapter. And you wonder why it's there. Well, it's there for a very important reason, obviously. It's there because, you see, it sets forth the typical framework. We spoke briefly about that in our first study. Because the character of Judah is the character of the nation to whom Christ came. So what was Judah's problem? So let's just briefly summarise what we've just read in Genesis 38. In verse 1, he has friendship with the world, which James, when writing to the diaspora, says to them in James 4 verse 4, that friendship with the world is enmity with God. So that was his first problem. Then we read in verse 2 that he marries an alien. He marries outside the truth. In verses 7 to 10, he has two evil boys that Yahweh kills. I'll comment upon that in a minute. In verses 11 to 14, he's a covenant breaker. He fails to keep a promise to Tamar and is entrapped by it in due time. In verses 15 and 16, he's a fornicator, like Esau, Hebrews 12 and verse 16. And in verses 24 to 26, he's exposed as a hypocrite. And of course, hypocrisy was a major failing of the Jewish religion in the times of our Lord Jesus Christ. He was always pointing out the hypocrisy of the people to whom he came. Matthew 23 verse 13, not the least of those. So what we have here in the life of Judah in this 22 years after the betrayal of Joseph is actually an encapsulation of the character of the people that Christ had to deal with. Now I don't want to spend too much time on the grubby details, but we do have to spend a bit of time on it. Because you see, the meaty part of this study is actually at the end when you're all asleep. It's actually when we get to the end of Genesis 38. This is when we get to the meaty part, the beautiful part of Genesis 38. And the birth of those two boys from Tamar, Pharez and Zerah. And we're going to see just how wonderful that is. It's one of those allegories, that beautiful allegories that's found in Genesis. Like the one that we've done in our readings today in Galatians chapter 4. We'll come to that a little bit later. Now you might have picked up from the title of these first two studies that I'm suggesting that this is the basis of Luke chapter 15 and 16. Now we'll come to that, God willing, tomorrow in our first study. We'll have a look at the parables of the lost. We're going to find that here in Judah we've got both the sons. You know, you've got the son that was lost outside the house, you've got the son that was lost inside the house, just the other way around. Because in chapter 37, up to that point, the betrayal of Joseph, Judah is clearly lost inside the house. He's driven by the prophet motive. You know what the parables of the lost are about, don't you? You've got the parable of the sheep, the parable of the coin. What do you think about when you think about coins? All right, the prophet motive. So we'll come to that and we'll show as best we can that what we have here in Judah is the whole package of what Christ encountered. And they are there in the parables of the lost of Luke chapter 15. More of that tomorrow. So what happens here in chapter 38 is that having been lost inside the house, he ends up being lost outside the house. He leaves the truth, as we say in our language. He leaves the truth. He leaves his family. He leaves his father. He goes out. He makes friends in the world. He marries in the world. He has absolutely no interest in the things that belong to Israel. And you know that happens over and over again, don't you? People who are lost inside the house invariably at some point will be lost outside the house. That's how it works. And so Judah ends up in a pile of trouble and a pile of misery. And we're going to see that because God hasn't given up on him. God hasn't given up on him. And so Judah is going to find the hand of God working in his life quite dramatically, and he's going to find it very, very painful indeed. So that's the story of Genesis 38. So let's dig down to some detail. I love the way that our reader began reading verse 1. Thank you very much for that, because he must be listening to Alexander Scourby, putting a little bit of emphasis into the reading. Verse 1 of Genesis 38 says this: "And it came to pass at that time..." Now, there are people who argue about what that means. They say, oh, well, the Hebrew would allow for this to be before the betrayal of Joseph, etc. I don't believe that. Just read the record. It's pretty simple. The context is pretty simple. This is after the betrayal of Joseph, I believe. And what we have here now is 22 years to the end of this chapter, before the events unfold, and obviously, in due course, Joseph is made known to his brethren. So it reads in verse 1 that he went down from his brethren. Now in the Hebrew, the word is yarad. It means to descend. And of course, this is talking about what happens spiritually as well, isn't it? He was going down. It doesn't finish there, because it goes on to say this: "And he turned in to a certain Adullamite." Turned in? What does that mean? Take a motel for the night? No. This phrase, turned in the Hebrew, is the word natar. It means to stretch or to spread out, and by implication to bend away. And Strong says, including moral defection. So you see, when he's turning in to this Gentile, he's actually turning away from the things of his heritage. He was brought up in the truth. He had the heritage of the truth. But now he's gone down. He's gone to the world. He makes friends in the world. And he's doing this because there's moral declension at work here in the life of Judah. And it goes on to say that he came across this Adullamite, certain Adullamite. Now the word certain in the Hebrew is ish. And ish, of course, can mean, in certain contexts, it can mean a great man or a mighty man. He's clearly a man of some standing among the Canaanites. And it goes on to say his name was Hira. Hira means a noble family, in the sense of splendour. So, you can put a picture together, can't you? Here is Judah. He's driven by the profit motive. We know that from Genesis 37:26. What profit is there? And being driven by the profit motive, not having a real interest in the truth, he decides to forsake his family. He's going to leave the truth and go down and make his peace with the Canaanites and get involved with them. And he gets involved with a very prominent Canaanite. And of course, when you do this, what happens? Well, there are women there as well, and some of them are nice-looking women. Yeah, you could write the script, couldn't you? It happens over and over again. Look at verse 2. "And Judah saw there." All right? Judah saw there. That's what happens. "A certain Canaanite, whose name was Shua, and he took her and went in unto her." So Judah was 39 years of age. He was as yet unmarried. He now marries into the world. And of course, what comes out of that, what is produced by that, of course, is a dysfunctional family. So dysfunctional that God has to get involved to try and sort it out. Now that is a very, very sad story. It's sad because it happens all too often. True? Happens all too often. When young people or younger people lose sight of the heritage that they were given, You know, I often say when I stand before teenagers at Bible school, and I might say it again tonight after this meeting, I often say that the greatest blessing that God ever gave me was that I was born into a Christadelphian family. But I don't think I'd be in the truth if it wasn't for that fact, brothers and sisters. I think that's the greatest blessing that God ever gave me. But not everybody realises that, do they? And Judah didn't realise that. He didn't appreciate the heritage that he had. And sadly we see it over and over again. So there's a lesson to be learned here for our younger people. Appreciate the heritage that you were given by the accident of birth. Yeah, accident of birth. A lot of people out there who know nothing about the truth because they weren't born, and they'll probably never come to it until the kingdom age perhaps. And that is a great blessing if you realise it. Judah didn't. So what happens? Well, verse 3. She conceived and bare a son, called his name Now, means awake or watchful. And by the way, that word son that precedes it is the Hebrew word ben. And ben means the builder of a family. How would you like to build your family, brethren, with this boy that Yahweh kills? He is so wicked. He's the product of a dysfunctional family and God can't tolerate him. Puts him to death. Would you like to have your family built by that boy? So what awake or watchful, that's a misnomer, as it proved to be. All right, what does he do? Well, it says in the record, in verse 4, she conceived again and bare a son, and she called his name Onan. Now, Onan means strong, but he was strong, all right, but only in the ways of the flesh, as it proved. And both of these boys are going to end up in a box, both of them, because God gets involved. And we read on in verse 5, and she yet again conceived and bare a son, and called his name Shelah. Now, Shelah means a request or a petition, and he was going to be the subject of a request and a petition, this boy, because he was promised, of course, to Tamar after the death of and Onan. And Tamar would have kept on reminding Judah, you know. She would have said, you know, the promise was that I could have Shelah when he gets a little older. And she never got him, because Judah couldn't keep a promise either. So what happens? Well, the record tells us what happens. Judah took a wife, verse 6, for his firstborn, whose name was Tamar, the palm tree. Now, it appears, it's evident, because we've only got 22 years for the whole chapter, it's pretty evident that was married when he was around 15 years of age. Now, that's not unusual. Those of you who know a little bit about the historic chapters of the Bible, especially in the latter years of Judah's history, will know that they married very young in those days. I'm not recommending that, by the way. But it appears as though he was about 15 years of age, or thereabouts. Quite young, of course, and obviously irresponsible. And we read this, verse 7. And Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of Yahweh. Now that word wicked is the common word, re'ah, in the Hebrew, means bad or evil or malignant. Rotherham simply translates it, he was displeasing in the eyes of Yahweh. And so God slays him. Yahweh slew him, the record says. Now, think about this for a while, brothers and sisters. Do you think that Cain's crime of murdering his brother was more serious than the crimes that committed, or that Onan, his brother, committed, recorded here in this chapter? Probably not. I think they were probably far more serious. Cain's sin was far more serious. You wouldn't compare this to what Cain did to his brother. Did God kill Cain? No. He chased him away. He didn't kill him. Can you tell me of any record where God steps in to kill the children of someone that he's interested in? It's rare, isn't it? So why? Why does God kill and then Onan for his behaviour? Well, there's only one reason. There's only one possible reason. It's God at work to convert Judah. He's doing it deliberately. Well, these boys deserve it, but he's doing it deliberately because he's about the process of converting Judah. He wants Judah to know the heartache that he brought to Joseph and to Jacob And he wants him to go through the same grief, the same process, until he becomes sensitive to that. And that's where Judah ended up. He became very, very sensitive to the pain of his father Jacob. So God is at work here. And Judah acknowledges that in Genesis 44, that God was at work. So we read on. What about his brother Onan? Well, verse 8. And Judah said to Onan, go in unto thy brother's wife and marry her and raise up seed to thy brother. So we here have, of course, the introduction of the levirate principle. It became the levirate law under the law of Moses in due course, where if your brother died and he didn't have any seed to continue on the inheritance, then you went in, you took his wife and produced seed for your brother. So this was a principle being established very early in the... Now where did he learn this from? Well, he would have learned it, wouldn't he? From Jacob and from Isaac and others that he had reason to listen to as a young man or young boy. He would have learnt this principle. So he applies it here, but it doesn't work. Verse 9. And Onan knew that the seed should not be his. And it came to pass when he went in unto his brother's wife, he spilled it on the ground, lest that he should give seed to his brother. So what is animating Onan? The very same principle that animated his father, Judah. What? Profit. That was the principle. Now think about this. If you were in his position, you think about it and think, yeah, well, I'll take Tamar and go in unto her and I'll get the sensual pleasure out of that experience, but I'm not going to go any further. I'm not going to impregnate her because that will bring me responsibility. I will then have responsibility for the child that's produced. So I want the pleasure, but I don't want the responsibility. Now our world wouldn't be motivated like that, would it? You know, we see so much of that, don't we? People want the pleasure, they don't want the responsibility. Now that's what motivated Onan. And so God said, right, I killed your brother, I'll kill you. So he takes him out of the way too. So he's got two tragedies within a very short space. Two boys, gone. Imagine what this is doing to his wife, what it did to him. Well, his wife doesn't last too much longer either. She probably dies of a broken heart. Go on to read this in verse 10. The thing which he did displeased Yahweh, therefore he slew him also. Then said Judah to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, remain a widow at thy father's house till Shelah thy son be grown. For he said, lest peradventure he die also, as his brethren did. Now, hang on. What did I just read? Did you read that? Do you know what he's doing, brothers and sisters and young people? He's actually saying that his two boys died because of Tamar. She's the problem. Read it again. In verse 11. Remain a widow at thy father's house. So the first thing he says to him, look, get out of here. I don't want you in my house. Because you're a problem. You go and live in your father's house. Yeah, you put on your widow's garment. Go and live in your father's house. I don't want you around here. And then we read this. Till Shelah my son be grown, for he said, lest peradventure he die also. He's implying that the problem was not or Onan. It was Tamar. And that's why he didn't give Shelah to Tamar. Even when he came of age, at the same age that and Onan were, about 15, and she knew that. She knew what age they were. And when Shelah got to that age and she was not given to him as wife, she knew something was wrong. He was blaming her for the death of his sons. Now this would never happen. We would never have this happen in our community, would we? Where the wheels fall off in a family, and it's obvious why, because it's a dysfunctional family and the truth's not upheld properly. And we wouldn't blame anybody else for that, would we? Oh, I happen to know it happens. We can never see, can we? We can never see the problems in our own. Jacob couldn't see the problem with Rachel. Remember the perfunctory search that he made of her tent? You ever look at the record of Genesis where it tells us that he searched the tent in Genesis 31. He went to Jacob's tent, then he went to Leah's tent, then he went to the handmaid's tent, Then he went to Leah's tent. Then he went to Rachel's tent. He suspected Leah. He did not suspect Rachel. And she makes a lame excuse. Oh, Dad, it's that time and I can't get up. Oh, don't worry, dear. I don't really suspect you. She's sitting on him. You never suspect the people like yourself. Right? You're blinded to that. That was his problem. And Judah is blaming Tamar for the death of his 2 boys. And that's why he won't give. He will not give Shelah to her. We read on in verse 12. In the process of time, the daughter of Shua, Judah's wife, died. So here's the 3rd tragedy in a short space of time. You know what it's like. I don't have to tell you anything about this, do I? You get tragedies happen like that. It rocks you to your foundations. Now this has got, it's a triple whammy. A triple whammy. He's lost 2 boys, and now he's lost his wife. And we know he's grieving. You know why we know he's grieving? Because it says in verse 12, and Judah was comforted. So how's he going to get his real comfort, do you think? What's he going to do to sort of get rid of this grief that he's feeling? Well, go back to the prophet. Go back to the prophet. So it says at the end of verse 12, he went up to his sheep shearers to Timnath, he and his friend Hira the Adullamite. So they go back to business. That'll take the pressure off. All right? But unfortunately, he's forgotten something. He's forgotten the promise that he made to Tamar, that she would be given to Shelah, his 3rd son, when he came of sufficient age. He's forgotten the covenant that he made. So he's a covenant breaker as well. He puts profit before anything else. But Tamar's not going to have anything of this. She's not going to have any part of that. She takes the law into her own hands and she prepares herself to trap Judah, to trap him, so that we read in the record that she prepares herself by a place called Enaim. See, there it says in verse 14. She put her widow's garments off from her and covered her face with a veil and wrapped herself, sat in an open place. Now, reference here, this word open in the Hebrew is actually a proper name of a town on the way to Timnath. And by the way, the Timnath here is not the Timnath of Samson of Judges chapter 14. This is not the assigned portion where Samson gets himself into trouble. It's another one in Judah. So here we've got this little place called Enaim. That's how Rotherham, for example, translates it. He says, she sat down in the entrance, that is the opening to Enaim. So she finds this town and she knows it's on the route between where Judah leaves home to go down to his sheep shearers. She sits in the gate and plays, as it were, the harlot. And we read in verse 15 that Judah sees her and he falls victim. She covered her face, as harlots did in those days, and he turned unto her by the way. What language? Isn't that such beautiful language? Isn't this what happens when sin strikes? Turned unto her by the way. We're all in the way, and we sometimes turn out of the way, don't we? We lose sight of the objective. We turn out of the way. That's what Judah does. Turned in unto what he thought was a harlot, his daughter-in-law, waiting to entrap him. The record says in brackets, for he knew not that she was his daughter-in-law. And so she asks for some kind of guarantee that he will send the kid that he offers. What are you going to give me as a guarantee? Well, thy signet, verse 18. She said, thy signet, and thy bracelets, and thy staff that is in thy hand. You know, to all of these things, brothers and sisters and young people, have relationship to the heritage that Judah had. The signet, the Hebrew word means the seal or the signet. There are 14 occurrences of that word in the Old Testament. It relates to the tribes of Israel in Exodus 28 verse 11, and the kingship of Judah in Jeremiah 22 and verse 24, and Haggai chapter 2 and verse 23. So these things have to do with the heritage that Judah had been given, and he's giving it away. He's throwing it away as though it's nothing. Treats it with contempt. And that, of course, is still a problem today. We can treat our heritage with contempt. So here is this woman, and he thought, verse 15 says, he thought her to be a harlot. And that word thought happens to be the word chashad. And of the 124 occurrences of that word, the first and the last one are very illuminating. Because you see, the first one is in Genesis chapter 15 verse 6. When God counted to Abraham his faith for righteousness. He counted. The word counted is this word that is rendered here thought. And the last occurrence is in Malachi 3:16. When Yahweh makes up his jewels, it says, they will be a certain quality of people. Those who thought upon his name. That's your word. So you see, its first and last occurrences tell us something about that word. He thought her to be a harlot. He counted her to be a harlot. And he discounted his heritage. That's this man Judah. He's in deep trouble, is Judah. And so we go on to read what happens. Now, we don't have to go into the gory details. But of course, when he sends his friend, now think about this, he sends his friend. If you've gone out and consorted with a woman of ill repute, you're going to go down and ask your friend to go and find her? Would you do that? I don't think I would. I think I'd go myself. I wouldn't want to be embarrassed. But Judah doesn't care. Look at this record, verse 20. And Judah sent the kid by the hand of his friend the Adullamite to receive his pledge from the woman's hand, but he found her not. Then he asked the men of that place, saying, where is the harlot that was in the gate of this place called Enaim, by the wayside? Well, I said there was no harlot in this place. What are you talking about? We don't have harlots around here. Now, in the Hebrew, this is a different word for harlot. The word that is used back in verse 15 simply means a harlot. But the word that is used here, brethren and sisters and young people, in verse 21, is a different word. It's the word kadesha. It means a female temple prostitute or a harlot. So that Rotherham translates it, where is the devotee, she that was in the name by the way? Where's that woman that's that's used as a prostitute in the temple services of the Baal worshippers? Where's she? We got no one like that here, they say. There's no one like that here. And so he returned to Judah in verse 22 and said, I can't find her. And the men of the place said there was no such person there anyway. And Judah said, let her take it to her. I don't care about the signet. I don't care about the staff and the bracelets, all of which have some connection with my heritage. I don't care about that. He says, lest we be shamed. Shamed? He's a Christadelphian. Lost outside the house. Disgusting behaviour. Lest we be shamed, he sends his friend to collect his pledge. I don't think I'm overemphasising it. Judah is at the bottom of the barrel, isn't he? Right at the bottom of the barrel. But God's at work. God is at work. And slowly but surely, he's turning the mind of this man. And next comes the biggest blow of his life. We read in the record of Genesis 38 and verse 24 that it came to pass about 3 months after that it was told Judah, saying, Tamar, the palm tree, the upright one, the one that we're told in Psalm 92:12, doesn't bend, it goes straight towards the light, the upright one, and she wasn't particularly upright in this matter, of course. Tamar, thy daughter-in-law, hath plagued the harlot. And also, behold, she is with child by whoredom. And Judah said, bring her forth, and let her be burnt. Oh yeah. Mr. Hypocrite. Well, she's kept the pledge. She's got the evidence. So in verse 25, when she was brought forth, she sent to her father-in-law, saying, by the man whose these are, the signet, the bracelets, the staff, you recognise them? By the man who owns these, I am with child. And so Judah acknowledged them in verse 26. And he said, she hath been more righteous than I. That wouldn't have been hard. She's been more righteous than I. Because that I gave her not to Shelah my son when I should have. And she knew I should have. I didn't give him. I didn't keep my promise. So she took the matter into her own hands, and here I am. I'm trapped, and I deserve it. That's what he's saying. I deserve it. It's the start, brothers and sisters, of a process. It's the process of Proverbs 28. I want to take you to Proverbs, just to get away briefly from Genesis. Proverbs chapter 28. Now, if you haven't been through this, and the need for this, then tell me your secret, please. I want to know what your secret is. Because all of us will find ourselves in this position where we need to acknowledge our sins and make a new start. Proverbs 28 in verse 13 and 14. He that covereth his sins shall not prosper. The word sins there, by the way, pesha means revolt or rebellion. And that's exactly where Judah was, rebelling against his heritage. He that covereth his sins shall not prosper. But whoso confesseth and forsaketh them shall have mercy. There's not, maybe. Confesseth and forsaketh shall have mercy. And then it says in verse 14, happy is the Adam, and that's what the Hebrew word is, happy is the Adam that feareth continually. That's the word that's used of the continual burnt offering. Alright? It's deliberately drawn from that. Happy is the Adam that feareth continually. But he that hardeneth his heart shall fall into mischief. So you want to harden your heart and say, oh no, not me, I wouldn't do that. You're in trouble. Judah has taken the first step. Publicly confesses, she's more righteous than I. I'm the problem here. I'm the one that's caused all this. I didn't keep my promises. I messed around. No, it's the start. It's the beginning of the process of recovery. And most of us, probably all of us, have got to go through that at some point or another. So we come back to Genesis 38. So here we come now to the real core of Genesis 38. The birth of Phares and Zara. Verse 27 we read, and it came to pass in the time of her travail that, behold, twins were in her womb. Now, Jacob and Esau were diverse twins. It is evident, it's quite apparent, that Phares and Zara, born of Tamar, were virtually identical twins. And I want to demonstrate that to you. And it's very important because it's all part of the allegory that's presented here, as we shall see. It goes on to say in verse 28, and it came to pass when she travailed that the one put out his hand, and the midwife took and bound upon his hand a scarlet thread, saying, this came out first. Now, not all of us here will be experts in childbirth. My wife never gave birth to twins, so I don't understand the birth of twins. But I understand this, that if a baby is being born and its arm appears, then it's very unlikely that the other twin is going to be born before him. True? So you see, just as God was involved in the death of and Onan, because Onan's motivation was exactly the same as Judah's motivation, God's involved here too. This is not, I mean, you ask someone who knows about childbirth, you ask a midwife whether this could happen, and they will, no. The child's half out. You can't have the guy behind being born before. That's not going to happen. It does happen. So why? Clearly divine intervention. Why? We need to answer that question. Well, the one thing we do know is that the boy that put his hand out first has a red cord tied to it. So he's identified. All right? You know he's going to be born second because he comes out second. But it looked as though he's going to be born first. It's very important. Verse 29. And it came to pass as he drew back his hand that behold his brother came out. And she said, what's going on here? How hast thou broken forth? This breach be upon thee. Therefore she called his name Phares. Now Phares as a name means a breach. That's what the root word Peretz is rendered there, breach. That's how you get this name, Phares. So it has this idea of breaking forth or a breach. Then verse 30 says, and afterward came out his brother that had the scarlet thread upon his hand, and his name was called Zara. Now Zara means rising, or from the east, the brightness of the rising dawn. Okay, so this boy's name. The light that's going to develop, well, we're going to see the part that he plays in the divine scheme of things. So what about this red cord? You know, it's beautiful because it goes off into the rest of the scriptures, this red cord. The words we have here in verse 28 are a scarlet thread. In the Hebrew, the word is shani. Scarlet, crimson, properly, of course, the insect Coccus ilicis, the dried body of the female yielding the colouring matter from which they made the dye, which used for dyeing cloth, to scarlet or crimson. And so this word is commonly used, of course, under the law. Shani occurs 42 times in the Old Testament. The 33 occurrences in the law of Moses are always with the other Hebrew word tola, the crimson grub. So they used to have this grub that had this strong red colour in it, and they dried it and got that, and they used it as a dye. So there's a red scarlet cord. As I said, it's going to play a very important part in history to come. So what we have here, brothers and sisters and young people, is a divine allegory. Now before I launch into it, I want to take you to Galatians chapter 4, because this is in our readings for today, the New Testament. Let's go to Galatians chapter 4 and remind ourselves of the very fundamental allegory that Paul presents in the two women and the two sons. The two women, of course, are Hagar and Sarah, and the two sons are Ishmael and Isaac. We need to wrap our minds around this allegory because we're going to find that it occurs twice more in the record of Genesis. And here in Genesis 38 is one of them. The other one's going to be Genesis 48. We'll come to that later on in our studies, God willing. So here in Galatians 4, Paul says in verse 21, tell me, he says, ye that desire to be under the law, do ye not hear the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, the one by a bondmaid, the other by a free woman. Now we know who these are because it goes on to tell us. But he who was of the bondwoman was born after the flesh, but he of the free woman was by promise. Which things are an allegory, says Paul. For these two are the two covenants. So the two women represent two covenants. So who are they? The one from Mount Sinai, that's the law of Moses. Hagar represents the law of Moses in the scheme of things. She is the type of the law of Moses. And the children, or at least the son that she produced, Ishmael, is characteristic of the kind of children that unfortunately the law produced. Ishmael was circumcised at age 13. The Jews boasted about circumcision. He might have been circumcised in flesh, but like those who followed him, he was not circumcised in heart. So he's a very fitting type of Jews living under law. So Hagar represents the law of Moses, given at Sinai, Ishmael those living under the law. Verse 25 tells us that. For this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and answereth to Jerusalem, which now is, and is in bondage under the law with her children. Then we read this in verse 26. But Jerusalem, which is above, is free, which is the mother of us all. For it is written, and this is a quotation, of course, from Isaiah 54, verse 1, Rejoice, thou barren that bearest not. Break forth and cry, thou that travailest not. For the desolate hath many more children than she which hath an husband. Now we, brethren, as Isaac was, are the children of promise. So Sarah clearly represents the Abrahamic covenant. And the children born of that covenant are born by faith. And therefore, they are the spiritual Israel. So we've got this allegory which Paul presents to them. And I think most of us are very, very familiar with it. We may not be familiar with the one that occurs at the end of Genesis 38. So let's come back and have a look at it. So which came first in the order of things? The Abrahamic covenant or the Mosaic covenant? You answer me, they were 430 years apart. The Abrahamic covenant came well before the law of Moses. True? 430 years. So the Abrahamic's first, the law of Moses is second. So who was going to be born first here? Well, Zara. He was the one that popped his hand out. And the red cord goes around it. Then he pulls his hand back and his brother pops out before him. Yeah, that's exactly how it happened. God gave the Abrahamic covenant first, brothers and sisters, but it was not confirmed until the sacrifice of Christ. It came first in the order of things, but it was not confirmed until Christ came and made the sacrifice to confirm the promises made to the fathers. What about the Mosaic? Well, that was confirmed in Exodus 24. When Moses took... Let's have a look at Exodus 24. Because it actually talks there about the firstborns who do the job of priests. We read this, verse 3 of Exodus 24. And Moses came and told the people all the words of Yahweh and all the judgments, and all the people answered with one voice and said, All the words which Yahweh has said will we do. Moses wrote all the words, rose up early in the morning. He built an altar. He made 12 pillars to represent the 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent, in verse 5, the young men of the children of Israel. So who were they? Well, not just any ordinary young men. These were the firstborn. You know the ones that were swapped for the Levites in Numbers chapter 3? Before the Levites were appointed as the priestly tribe, it was the young men, the firstborn of Israel, that were the priests of Israel. So they were the ones who brought the offerings here. So what does Moses do with them? Well, he takes the blood in verse 6, puts it in basins, and he sprinkles on the altar in verse 6. In verse 7, he takes the book of the covenant, and he sprinkles that after reading it in the audience of the people, and he sprinkles the people in verse 8. So you see, the law of Moses was confirmed by blood at Mount Sinai. That's why, you see, at the beginning of Exodus 24 it says that the people of Israel couldn't come near the mountain and only Moses was to go near Yahweh. But later on in Exodus 24 you read in verses 9 to 11 that 70, Nadab and Abihu and 70 others went up to have a fellowship meal. God was in fellowship with Israel. The law of Moses had been confirmed by blood. But it was going to be a long, long time before the Abrahamic covenant would be confirmed by the blood of Christ. So the Abrahamic comes first in the order of delivery, but it's second. Now I want to show you two passages where Paul talks about this. Hebrews chapter 8. Hebrews chapter 8, Paul is talking about these two covenants. He says in verse 7, for if that first covenant, and by that of course he means the law of Moses, first to be ratified by blood, that first covenant had been faultless, then should no place have been sought for the second. So the Abrahamic is called the second. But hang on, the Abrahamic covenant was given 430 years before the law. Yeah, it was. But it was not ratified by blood, not confirmed by the sacrifice of Christ. So Paul calls it the second. Now have a look at Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 9. How are you coping with that? All right? Managing it? It's all part of this wonderful allegory in Genesis 38. Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 9. Then said he, Lo, I come to do thy will, O God. He taketh away the first, meaning the law of Moses, that he may establish the second, meaning the Abrahamic. All right? So Paul calls the law of Moses the first and the Abrahamic the second. Even though the Abrahamic was given before. It was born, as it were, in a sense, born before the Mosaic. That's exactly what happens in Genesis chapter 38, isn't it? You've got the boy, Sarah, putting his hand out, but then it's drawn back, and you've got his brother coming out before him. So then, that's the allegory presented to us. Zara is the Abrahamic, and what I said about these two boys is very important, because unlike Esau and Jacob, who were diverse twins, Pharez and Zara were probably quite normal twins, and therefore virtually identical. And like the Abrahamic covenant, Zara appeared first, was not confirmed. 430 years later, the Mosaic covenant superseded the Abrahamic for a time as the schoolmaster that would lead Israel to Christ. And Christ finally came and confirmed the Abrahamic covenant by sacrifice. But you see, the Mosaic covenant was introduced because of transgressions, or if I might use the word, breaches. The law of Moses was introduced because of breaches. What was his name? Pharez. Breach. In a sense, it was a breach, wasn't it? Bursting out before his brother. The law of Moses, however, was not opposed to the Abrahamic. And Christ came to fulfill it as he did, not to destroy it, as he said in Matthew chapter 5. Hence, the law, in a sense, was a twin. All of that is there in Genesis chapter 38. So why is it important? Well, it's important for this reason. In Ruth chapter 4, just come to Ruth 4. In Ruth chapter 4, this is what we read about the lineage of our Lord Jesus Christ through David. Ruth 4 and verse 18. We might ask the question, brothers and sisters and young people, if Pharez in the allegory represents the law of Moses, why was Christ in the line of Pharez? I want to answer that question. We're told that in verse 18 of Ruth 4 it says, Now these are the generations of Pharez. Pharez begat Hezron, Hezron begat Ram, Ram begat Aminadab, begat Nashon, begat Salmon, begat Boaz. Verse 21, Boaz begat Obed. Verse 22, Obed begat Jesse, and Jesse begat David. So when you come to Matthew chapter 1, that's the genealogy that's given, the line of Christ. Okay? So why was Christ born from Pharez? Well, because Paul says in Galatians 4 verse 4 that Jesus Christ was born of a woman, born under the law. He had to be in that line. He had to come through that line. But why did he come? Well, Paul explains it in a beautiful passage. And that passage is Romans chapter 15 and verse 8. Now I recognise that this is maybe a little complicated in part, but you'll see the reason for it in a minute. Romans 15 and at verse 8 we read this. Now I say that Jesus Christ was a minister of the circumcision. Notice this. A minister of the circumcision, the Jews, for the truth of God. What for? Why was he born amongst the Jews? Why was he born under the law? Why was he born of a woman? To fulfill the scriptures. That's why. But really, what for, Paul? Tells us at the end of verse 8. To confirm the promises made unto the fathers. That's why. Because the Abrahamic covenant, the second, had to be ratified by blood, and that was the blood of Jesus Christ. So that's why Christ had to come through fathers. But he came to confirm the promises made to Abraham, represented by a boy with a red cord on his hand. Alright? Now come with me to Joshua chapter 2. And while you're coming to Joshua 2, we'll get to this in due course, God willing, to Matthew chapter 1. Matthew chapter 1, and you can have a read of this prior to if you wish. It does something quite incredible. In the genealogy that's provided in Matthew chapter 1, normally with genealogies you go from son to the next eldest, to the next eldest, and so on. You go down the genealogy, don't you? Alright? Doesn't happen in Matthew. Both Phares and Zara are mentioned in Matthew chapter 1. And immediately you read of Rahab and Ruth, Gentiles, who came into the faith through the Abrahamic promises. And we meet one of them here in Joshua chapter 2. Her name is Rahab. She's a harlot. In the scheme of things, brothers and sisters and young people, she represents the remnant of Jewry post-Armageddon, when the 2/3 have been destroyed by the events of the Gogian invasion and the great earthquake, the Holocaust that will occur at that time, and the 2/3 of Zechariah chapter 13 and verse 8 perish. A third, or a fine third, will be brought through the fire. Rahab, in the divine scheme, the beautiful prophetic scheme of Joshua, represents that refined third. How do we know? Well, there's many indications. You know what they do to Rahab and her household? Do they come straight into the camp? No. They're left outside the camp. Outside the camp. Until there's a cleansing. And then they're brought in. And when she comes in, she marries who? Salmon. He's in the line of Judah. And through her is going to come, ultimately, the Lord Jesus Christ. She's a red cord lady, is Rahab. Let's have a look at it. I only want one verse in Joshua 2. It's verse 18. Because you know the story, don't you? You know how she receives the spies? She lets them down by a cord. Yeah, a red cord. And what did the spies tell her to do with that red cord? Well, they said, tie it in the window. And when we come, if you and your house are here in this place, you'll survive. You'll survive because of faith. So she puts the red cord in the window. Look at verse 18. Behold, when we come into the land, thou shalt bind this line of scarlet thread, so here's our word, scarlet thread, in the window, which thou didst let us down by. And thou shalt bring thy father and thy mother and thy brethren and all thy father's household home unto thee. And it shall be, if it goes outside the doors, will perish. You stay in here, with that red cord in your window, you're safe. Well, I think some of you might know. That little word line there. So the word line in verse 18, it's the Hebrew word tikvah. Tikvah. You've heard of ha-tikvah, yeah? This is the Hebrew word that is rendered preeminently hope or expectation. Now that is interesting, isn't it? Put this line, this scarlet thread, which is all about the hope of Israel, which you now have burning in your heart, Rahab. And you'll survive. So the red cord plays a very important part in the life of Rahab the harlot, and she ends up in Matthew chapter 1. We'll get to that in due time. Now come to chapter 7 of Joshua. There's another man who belongs to Judah, the tribe of Judah. And in the scheme of things, Achan, the troubler of Israel, sets forth the type. Joshua chapter 6 is the Armageddon chapter of the book of Joshua. Joshua 7, we have the cleansing of the house of Judah. What's the very first thing that Christ will do as a result of and immediately after Armageddon? You all know. He will cleanse the house of Judah. Save the tents of Judah first. And we'll come to this a bit more in later studies. Our Lord Jesus Christ, that's his first work. He establishes, when the earthquake has split the Mount of Olives and exalted Mount Zion, and the dust settles, the very first thing he does is put the throne of David there at the foot of Mount Zion, and the next thing he does is bring up the Jews that have survived. Someone says to him, what are these wounds in your hands? And you know the rest. The very first thing he does, the very first thing that happens after the Armageddon chapter in Joshua. It's about the cleansing of the house of Judah. So who's the man that's prominent in this? Well, we read in verse 16 of Joshua 7. So Joshua rose up early in the morning and brought Israel by their tribes, and the tribe of Judah was taken. And he brought the family of Judah, and he took the family of the Zarhites, the descendants of the little boy who had the red cord around his wrist. Took the descendants of Sarah, the Zarhites. And he brought the family of the Zarhites man by man. And Zabdi was taken. And he brought his household man by man. And Achan, the son of Carmi, the son of Zabdi, the son of Zerah, or Zara, goes right back to his heritage in Genesis 38, right back there, of the tribe of Judah, was taken. Joshua, of course, says to Achan, what have you done? Acknowledge what you've done. Give the glory to Yahweh. And he does that, and of course he's stoned. He ends up under a pile of stones with his family, who were conversant with him in the sin. So he doesn't meet a very pretty end. Why? What was his problem? You know what his problem was? A garment made from scarlet threads. That was his problem. You read with me Joshua chapter 7 and verse 21. When I saw among the spoils a goodly Babylonish garment, don't need to read the rest. If we were doing this from a different perspective, we would read the rest. That's all I want. You know what those words are in Hebrew? Babylonish garment. Shinar Adareth. Shinar. What do you know about Shinar? Well, wasn't that the place that Nimrod took his rebels to build the tower? To rebel against Yahweh? Yes. Yeah. But who was Nimrod's wife? Semiramis. Did you know, brothers and sisters, that the name Semiramis is a Greekised form of an Akkadian name? It's the original language of the area where Nimrod came from. Not that far from Ur the Chaldees, by the way. Alright? In the Akkadian, Semiramis' name was Summa Amat. When you take that Akkadian word, Summa, and bring it to Hebrew, you know what you get? Shinar. So this garment that Achan took from the city of Jericho, which was devoted to destruction because it was the centre of Babylonian worship in Canaan, and represented everything that Nimrod stood for, He took a Babylonian garment, which was a priestly garment, by the way. He's destroyed. And here is a man who has a heritage. The forefather was born with a red cord on his hand. And he doesn't appreciate his heritage. I wonder who he's like. I think he might be a little bit like Judah, who doesn't appreciate his heritage. But there's a woman who puts a red cord in a window who's only just heard about the truth because she really believes in the hope of Israel, like you and me. So we've set the basis. The stage is set for the recovery of Judah in the events of Genesis 38. You know how he ends up in that chapter? Bereft of 2 sons, bereft of a wife, publicly humiliated, has the birth of these 2 boys in the most unusual circumstances, and then you know what happens? Drought hits. And all his profit making and all his prosperity goes out the window, and he's forced back to his home. He goes back to Jacob, and things are happening in his mind. In our next study, God willing, we're going to see that the setting of the stage by Yahweh, working in this man's life, is bringing about a gradual change. A series of disasters involving personal loss have made him now reflective of the sufferings and the grief of others, especially of his father Jacob. And this is the man who in our study tomorrow is going to say, in the presence of his brothers, in the presence of Joseph, who he doesn't know yet, he's going to say, I'm not leaving Benjamin here because I can't do to Dad what we did 22 years ago. Can't do it. What a change. You know the lesson we're going to learn from that, brothers and sisters and young people? God can save anyone if they'll respond. You can be right at the bottom of the barrel. But if you suddenly wake up to yourself that God's at work in your life, he can do for you what he did for Judah.